Welcome to all my friends here. That's how I like to present and make this informal as possible. We're here to serve you guys, and if you guys have questions, and hopefully we have the answers, and if we don't, we'll get you the right answers. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, we like to make this informal as possible because I don't want you waiting to the end and maybe forget to answer that question. But in the event you need to leave, the sessions are recorded, right? And then you can always reach us in the islands as well, at the online island too, if you guys have stuff that you're working on. So my name's David, this is my colleague Nick, and we're gonna give you what we call a deep dive into enterprise deployments with Web AppBuilder. Out of curiosity, who's using Web AppBuilder today on enterprise? Enterprise? Okay, what about online? Okay, how about Developer Edition? Okay, all right, cool. Okay, so there'll be some mix for, for developer stuff. My colleague Nick here works on our professional services arm of Esri, so he's got real world practice of how to do this stuff. He works on a team that actually implements, our products in an environment to deliver to customers, so he's got some good information. So don't listen to me, listen to him, if you can. But hopefully we'll teach you something new, okay? So let's get started. All right, so what do we have today as far as our agenda? So we're gonna talk about some patterns, which many of you are probably familiar with, installation, configuration. As you know, we have a couple different ways you can configure Web AppBuilder for Developer Edition, specifically in an enterprise environment. Let's talk about a little about security, just mostly around certificates and stuff. We won't go too deep into that because that mainly goes more into the portal type stuff, application development, and then deployment and post deployment, right? So maybe give you some new tools to think about how you can deploy stuff, mainly around automation. Okay, so let's talk about enterprise deployment and what it is and what does it mean. So we have various implementation patterns, right, when we're thinking about WebGIS, okay? So if you think about ArcGIS Online, right, you don't need any local resources. It's all hosted. It's multi-tenant. You have an Esri SLA agreement, right, which means that we're gonna service your needs and make sure that things are responsive and scalable as you add more content to it. And then we have ArcGIS Enterprise, right, which provides access, identity, content management, system of engagement that's deployed on your infrastructure. You can do completely disconnected, right, from your environment as long as you have all those resources and you can access those. Security, URL control, SLA, all that stuff is controlled through that. And then obviously you're responsible for that, those hosted services for your customers. And then of course, we always can do a hybrid approach where you can mix different technologies from both. So I can have a hybrid of portal instances mixed with collaboration of ArcGIS Online. I can use information coming from ArcGIS Online over in my portal instance as well, okay? All right, so let's advance these slides. Okay. So when we think about these implementation patterns, so where does Web AppBuilder live? Okay, so embedded, your core component is going to be AGL or portal. It's integrated within your WebGIS workflow. When it's embedded, it's limited customization beyond like configuration. Up until last year, we allowed you to add widgets to enterprise, right? You can't extend themes within enterprise, but you can extend widgets and then add an application extension to portal, and then your users could take advantage of that. People have said, well, how do I do a template and push that up to my users? Like, what if you have a certain brand and the themes don't work within the Web AppBuilder Developer Edition in the sense that we can only have so many themes that doesn't meet your brand? Well, what you can do is you can create a theme and then you can basically host that template, which means you're responsible for that, put it on a web server, share that template out with your portal. Your users will see that in the carousel, right? If you do like a featured gallery for that particular template, and then let's say that with web map, they can use that template or that particular brand. So that's a way you can do that. And then regarding Developer Edition, it runs outside of your portal. You can share it with your users. That's an option. I typically don't like that because if I'm the developer, I want to control that. I want to give my users that capability. You could deploy it locally on your infrastructure if you want to go that route. And then obviously that's required for creating custom widgets and themes, okay? So just think about that as far as if you're thinking about implementation patterns. All right, so let's first talk about installation. So if you've never installed it. So after you download Web AppBuilder, your first decision is, okay, is this enterprise environment and how do I get it? You could, if you wanted to completely decouple from the JS API, by default, Web AppBuilder is pointing to our CDN, right, of our JavaScript API. But let's say if you're in a disconnected environment, I think I got a couple of questions yesterday in one of the sessions I did. How would they be able to accomplish that? Well, you would need to point that to a local copy of our JavaScript API, right? You could do that. But you got to remember all the machines got to be connected within that environment to make that happen. And the way you do it is basically you point to a local version of that API, and then you go to the client STEM app environment for the JS file, and then basically what you do is there's an application API variable from there, and then you can point it to yours for use, right? Comes with the warning though. You got to make sure those versions match up is what's hosted, okay? So just remember when you're doing that. And then also too, if you're planning to work on an entirely disconnected environment, you got to remember you have to supply your own base maps, okay? Because base maps are coming from ArcGIS Align, but if you're going to be disconnected, there's not going to be a direct source to that, okay? All right, so let's move on from there, okay? So when you think about installation, the way Web AppBuilder runs today is basically on Node.js. There's two options to run it. You can run as a Windows service, right? So you could do like npm install, load that, and then you could do like install that, call npm, run as a service, and then just do node server.js, and that'll run that as a service for you. Another option is to run it as a user, which I'm probably sure most of you are doing that today. And so if you think about an enterprise environment, if you want this to be available to multiple users across your org, the best option is to run that as a Windows service, right? But it does require that you install Node.js on your system, okay? And then, so it's pretty much you open a command prompt, do a server, find the server directory, run that npm script, install Windows service, and then you can do that, okay? If you don't install Node separately on your system, you can run the startup.bat script. We ship it with the Node executable. It will run with that script so you don't have to install Node on your system. The big drawback from though, it runs on the user account, okay? So it won't persist if users log off, right? Because it's only Windows only, okay? So just some things to think about. All right, so installation's pretty straightforward, but we still get a lot of questions regarding this. Because when you install Web AppBuilder, you need to add that to access your org's organization. And the basic way you do it is you create an application within an item on portal, and then basically you keep the default options, you select application, and then you enter basically the web URL of Web AppBuilder is gonna live in that instance, okay? And then what happens there is trying to get to the next slide here, this is where the importance is here is for portals and ArcGIS Online, we use, if you're using integrated Windows authentication, you would pretty much skip this step, right? Because your infrastructure would bypass this and has Windows authentication. But if your authentication, then that's like for the web tier, right? So it doesn't need OAuth. But if you're not going that for the rest of us, we need an app ID, right? Before Web AppBuilder will run. So within this item page that we see up here, we basically have app registration, and then we add the app location as a redirect URI. And then remember, certain of us, by security restrictions, I know at Esri we have certain ports blocked, certain ones are locked down, defined. Remember that if you do have ports that are set for where you can access that, you got to include the ports on there as well. Can't be something like a wildcard, for instance. And then the same goes with protocols, right? So just be safe to enter HTTP and HTTPS of all addresses. Web AppBuilder gets a little funky when it doesn't see HTTPS, right? So just think about those. And then as far as when Web AppBuilder is first installed and opened, right? And when this is not for web tier authentication, it's going to ask you for, hey, what's this app ID? So basically, you're going to copy that app ID from the item page, right? And then what you need, sometimes you'll go through a couple of, and this has happened to me, is sometimes I don't have the correct name of my machine, could be missing something, you'll get this invalid indirect URI. And basically how you fix that is, if you go to the server folder in Web AppBuilder, there's a signinfo.json. You could just delete everything in there, and then it'll prompt you for that dialog again, and then you just need to enter these correct credentials on that. And then once you have this app registration completed, this entry will be for like every portal that's going to be used with Web AppBuilder, okay? So you can do that. Another way is you can do it with client ID and secret as well, too. Okay, but obviously if your portal is web tier, you're going to say, see this web tier equals true, supports OAuth, you would have that in there if you wanted to. Web tier is false, but if it was web tier, it'd be true at that point, okay? All right, so let's talk about configurations. So there's a couple different ways how you can deploy Developer Edition. One way is you could, as long as your users could hit it, you could put Web AppBuilder on your portal's homepage, right? You could share the item with something like features, maps, and app groups, and then you can enable it to show up on the ribbon interface, right? That's one option. And you could take that a step further, and you can basically you could disable the embedded Web AppBuilder configuration if you wanted to. If you don't want users creating web apps from there, you could disable that. It would force them to go into the version that's stored on your homepage. That's one way. And basically, what that does is, let's say you have themes that you want people to use directly in the builder itself, right? You can do that. That's one, right? Or you might not want your users creating with the embedded version, right? So this is an alternative. And then how you enable that is basically there's, under your C's program file, under portal customizations, there's this config.json. You could find that path, and there's Web AppBuilder enabled. If you change that to false, go to services and reboot your portal, that Web AppBuilder embedded version won't appear in that create apps, okay? If you want to disable it like that. And don't worry, you're not violating Esri software license agreement because you're just changing a config file.json at that point. The other option, and if you go back to your web map and you reload the page and you try sharing again, you'll see something like this. There will be no Web AppBuilder in the UI for them to create any apps. But the beauty of this is what you could do is you could create templates and have those templates loaded into this carousel here, and their users could create apps from there, okay? When you're thinking about, let's say you decide, you know what, I don't want to disable Web AppBuilder from the UI standpoint, and maybe you just want to focus on widget development. Basically what you do is you add a configuration to your portal, which is basically an application extension, right? And basically what that means is you need to put it on a server that's just accessible. So this could be a web server, so you could have a staging server, pushing it to production, because obviously you don't want to be doing development in production. You could have, as long as it's accessible to that application extension, it can access that manifest.json, which basically will load all those dependencies for that widget, and then you can load that in various applications. And then later on, when we go to deploy, I'll show you a simple Python script using our Python API, how you can clone an item and basically all its dependencies. And as long as you have that application extension on an available web server, you can copy all its dependencies from staging to production. And we'll show you an example of that. So configuration is pretty simple. You can add a virtual directory, right? Think of it as a web server. It's got to be enabled. You got to allow anonymous access. It's got to be HTTPS. Got to have cores enabled, right? Otherwise, you'll get this cross-domain reference error if you try and go across cross-domains. It's pretty simple. You just go to your web config and allow that. And then you can also, sometimes you got to enable JSON handler because we're reading this manifest JSON. And then you register that with your manifest, right? And the last thing you need to do is just share that with your users, right? Because your users got to be able to access that widget within that application itself. Okay, so the next thing is when we're dealing with certs, right? I know I'm guilty sometimes because when I'm doing development, I just try to get things up pretty quickly. I don't try and go to a certificate authority to install a cert that's registered. Luckily, Web AppBuilder has a self-signed cert. You can work for it. And that's good for developing, right, on your own machine, but it's a big problem when your app author accesses web across the network because you could get like bounce of services and stuff. But let's say you do have your own cert, you can replace the default cert, domain or commercially signed one. It's pretty simple. You can convert that as well. Just replace that CA cert perm and in server, and then you just restart web. Pretty straightforward from that. And now we're going to get into good stuff. Okay, so if you guys fell asleep there, you want to be awake now. Eric, you're guilty.
All right, we're going to take a little bit of a left turn. That was right, left. And we're going to talk about a concept that I call enterprise development, which, what do we mean by enterprise development? And I'm in professional services, like David was saying, so a lot of the time I end up writing custom applications for people, and this is the kind of stuff that I run into quite a bit. And the best ways to use Web AppBuilder to solve these problems. When we talk about Web AppBuilder, you hear about custom widgets with the Web AppBuilder Developer Edition, but most of the time I'm doing way more than just custom widgets. So what do I mean by Web AppBuilder, or what do I mean by enterprise development? So these are some of the topics that come up. So generally you've got more than a single developer that's contributing to the baseline. So the way that you manage your source code is important. You run into design challenges with code and Web AppBuilder widgets. And what I mean by that, and I'll kind of dive into this, is you're writing a lot of logic that may not really belong in the widget. It may be application logic that goes outside the widget. So I'll talk about how we handle those situations. David mentioned this a little bit too, and we run into this all the time where you've got a development server, a testing server, a production server. How do you deploy into all of those environments and do that with Web AppBuilder? This is my favorite one because you've got a mix of custom widgets that you've done. You've modified the out-of-the-box widgets because everybody wants changes to everything when they see an application. And like I said, you've got custom application logic that you're dealing with. Something that is not the most exciting topic, but I love unit tests. So I'm going to talk about unit tests, and I'm going to try to convince you to go to the session where they talk about unit testing with Web AppBuilder. So I'm going to convince you to go, and then you go and deep dive into it in that session. And then continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. I know they just had a session that talked about this in the building for production. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's definitely a topic that it comes up when you're doing larger scale applications. So again, kind of visualizing where this is, you've got to the left-hand side, you've got just Web AppBuilder normal, no coding, just configuration stuff. You've got the Dev Edition with your custom widgets. And then you've got an option that's always there to just go completely custom app and just use the JavaScript API and go that route. We're going to sit right about here. So where we're at with this topic is you've been using Developer Edition, but you're running into a lot of stuff, and you're like, man, I wish I would have just gone with the JS API to start with. Why did I use Developer Edition? I find myself there a lot. So how do we end up here? Well, it comes from both design decisions that your team makes and stakeholders. When you initially start out with an application, you may not have that much functionality. So Web AppBuilder is a great starting point. You've got a lot of stuff that comes with the out of the box, so you can get an app up and running really quick. So that's how it starts. And then after you show that off to people, they're like, hey, this is great. We want some custom widgets. So Web AppBuilder meets that need pretty well. Then they start going into the, well, we've got that widget that does this, but we want to change that. And you're like, well, that's not our code. That's an out-of-the-box widget. We don't want to change that. And they're like, well, that's great. We want this feature anyway. So you start customizing the out-of-the-box code too. And then, like I was mentioning earlier, you get to the point where you're like, man, I should have started with the JavaScript API, not Web AppBuilder. It's not necessarily true because there are ways to handle it, and that's what I deal with all the time. So from the developer perspective, like I said, you kind of prefer to keep your application logic and your user interface logic separate. So the concept that Web AppBuilder has of writing a custom widget where you've got all your logic crammed into the widget has its benefits, but when you're writing larger scale applications, that's not really realistic. An example of that I'm going to go into is you've got like utility code. I don't want to get like too deep into like application logic, but everybody's written utility methods that do specific things. You may not want that to be in your widget. You've got logic that multiple widgets share, and then one of my favorite ones is you've got application initialization logic that you want to occur, but you don't want to put that in a widget because that doesn't happen until you open the widget. So this is the scenario, just a simple concept, focusing on like utility classes. So we've got custom widget that we've been working on, and over the course of working on that widget, we've needed to do something with arrays. And we've written methods for getting unique values out of arrays. So you've got a whole bunch of values in there, and you just want unique in case there's any duplicates. You've got another one that you take two arrays, you just want the difference. So nothing rocket science with that. This is where it starts, because you've written your custom widget, you've been focusing on a widget, so those methods are in that widget. Well, that doesn't seem right, because that's way user interface. So you at least break it apart, and you move those over to a utilities class. And then you end up with another widget. You're like, well, I don't want to reference the array utilities that's in this other widget, so you move it out. Common pattern that goes for us way beyond utility stuff. It goes into that application logic. But that's the scenario that we're talking. Simple concept, I think. Another one where we run into this a lot is like I mentioned. So we've got this scenario where we've got an application. In this application, we want the user to define a spatial area on the map. And they want to do some processing of the data that's in that spatial area. So on the initial app startup, they want the spatial filter to be set to the extent of the map. But then there's kind of the kicker here is after the spatial filter's been modified, we want the application to start up and retain the state of that spatial filter. So we want to save that state. So when you look at this from like just focusing on widgets, well, you go into it thinking, well, we'll create this widget. The widget will manage a graphics layer. That graphics layer is going to hold that drawn spatial filter. And then when the widget starts up, we'll create that layer and add it to the map. But like I said, we want the application to start up with a filter already drawn to the map. So how do we do that if that logic is in the widget? And then being able to save that filter to persistent storage, like that would be part of this too, loading it from persistent storage. It's like, man, that doesn't sound like a user interface logic. That's application logic. I don't really want that up in the widget. So again, same kind of thing. We've got our custom widget, but we want that logic somewhere else. So we've got something like a filter manager. The filter manager is the thing that's managing that graphics layer, not the widget. The initialization, the saving of that filter, the loading of the filter would be in there. So if we do it that way, well, what initializes the filter manager? If it's not the widget that's doing it when the widget opens, where does that stuff go? So a lot of times what we end up doing is we create, I use the word controller, which I know is overloaded because Web AppBuilder has a concept of a controller. But it's really, with this guy, it's really where your application logic is initialized. And you can do this as, we call it an off-screen widget. So it really is still a Web AppBuilder widget, but you've got hooks in there so that when the Web AppBuilder framework spins up, this will start, there's no UI there. So you don't have to open a widget to kick off that logic. But then this would then call initialize on the filter manager, which would go to your persistent storage, pull in that spatial filter you've got, draw to the graphics layer without requiring any widgets to start up. Another way that I've done this, which you start doing some kind of crazy things to Web AppBuilder, is you can actually find hooks in Web AppBuilder itself when it spins up if you debug through the code, and you can find places in there to do it, which sometimes that's important because with the going the route of of a widget that is the application controller that doesn't have a user interface, you can't really control when that gets initialized. It's really the Web App Builder framework that decides when it instantiates that. So you may need more fine-grained control than that. So when we look at this from source code management or code, where does it go? If you look in Web App Builder and you're digging through, you will see a libs folder. That's where a lot of the custom logic that we write ends up. And when you think about it, when you're writing an application, it kind of makes sense. We're using Web App Builder basically as a framework, and we're adding our application logic as yet another piece that needs. So that's where our code usually ends up going. So there are drawbacks to this, and I run into this a lot because we'll demonstrate our applications and we'll show somebody a widget because that's kind of the framework of Web App Builder. People see widgets, they understand what widgets are, and like, hey, we want that widget too, can we take that? And since you didn't have all of your code in the widget itself, it's much harder to just take that widget, pick it up, and hand it to somebody else. You have to bring all of your application logic with it too. So again, source code management, to kind of talk about a lot of what we do. And most of the time, I'm not really building widgets, I'm building applications. So I look at this as, how do I manage everything in order to build my application? There's a few different ways to do this. Not every way is the right way, of course. So we'll go through some options. You could not do source control. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that, but you know, some people do. You can source control everything. So this is where you're like taking Web App Builder, you're downloading Web App Builder Developer Edition, you're throwing that in source code control. You don't need to do that. You don't need to source code manage Web App Builder. You can take, and this is similar to like when you go to Web App Builder and you download the app. If you look in Web App Builder, you will see like all of your apps get created under the apps folder, like 2, 3, 4, and so on. You could take the contents of that, or you could go to the Web App Builder WYSIWYG editor, download your application, and you could source control that. That is an okay option. Like I could understand people wanting to do that. But what we end up doing is we source code control only the code that we write. And then we have a build system in place that will take the code that we've written and inject it into Web App Builder. One of the benefits of doing that for us, which I like much more than just like going to your downloaded app and source code controlling that, is when you want to upgrade Web App Builder editions, you can do that. You can go grab, I want to upgrade from 2.8 to 2.9. Well, I can go grab 2.9, run it through my same build system, inject all my code now into 2.9, and I've just upgraded my application to use the latest Web App Builder. So this is kind of an overview of the build process that we do. I've written really crazy, complicated build systems for Web App Builder. But basic concept is that you're taking your repository, like I said, you're running it through that build system. You can inject it into STEM apps, so you can still use the WYSIWYG editor to create your widgets, or you can inject it into the application that you've already got created. Most of the time when I do Web App Builder stuff, I deviate so far with it that I'm not really using the WYSIWYG editor anymore. So I inject everything into the applications that I've created. And you can use, I know some of the other sessions that we do, they use Grunt. I typically use Gulp. I don't know why I switched. I don't know. So I use Gulp these days. Another thing, and I know you're going to talk a little bit about this too, but the app build process with configurations and deploying to multiple environments is a challenge. So a lot of times we'll end up with the configurations of the widgets, we'll end up source code controlling those. And when you go and configure a widget, point it to the services that you have, that's great, but what happens when you need to move that to a different environment? So you really need, instead of this one configuration that's pointed to this specific service, you need to be able to point to dev for your dev environment, staging for a staging environment, production for a production environment, and so forth. So again, since I'm using Gulp all the time, this is kind of how I do it, and I'll walk through this to show you what's happening in a second. But we have these JSON files that are really just, they're for each environment. They will hold the URLs to the specific environment. And then the configuration files that we maintain have these @ variable names in them. And that's so that we can use something called gulp replace. Grunt has an equivalent, but it'll rip through all of those and replace them with the values that come out of either the dev.json, staging, or prod, or however many environments that you point it to. So the output of that would be those 3 configurations, each with the specific URLs for that environment. So what this ends up looking like is this. So And it's migrated over the years. Like, we've done this several different ways, so there is really no right way to do it. I have, and to be honest, this isn't Web AppBuilder, this is Node, but it's the same concept. So we've got an appconfig.json. This is the template for that. So that's where we put the variables that are going to be replaced. And then I've got my dev.js, which is variables that point to the dev environment. In this case, like, these are mimicking some GP tools that live out there. And then we've got the pointer to the host that those go. So myorg-dev. And the only difference really here is myorg test. So this will generate an app config file, or in the case of Web AppBuilder, the configuration files for your widgets. When I run it through this build system, this one allows me to pick the environment that I want to deploy it to. And you can set this stuff up so it's using an environment variable, so it'll just do it if you're doing continuous integration or continuous deployment. We'll run it for dev, and it will kick out this appconfig.json, the real one that will be used. So if you see myorg-dev is now in there. I could do the same thing here for, let's do test, and that'll upgrade it to test. So that's how we build all the configuration files and get them to go into different environments. We do that for web maps too. Web maps are a challenge as well, because you've got a portal that's in your development environment, then you've got another portal that's in testing, and you need to get those web maps through those different environments. So we will actually take the web maps, export them as JSON, and source code control them ourselves a lot of the times. So like I said, unit testing. I'm not going to go too deep into here, but like I said, I want to convince you to do this. How many of you unit test? Okay. When we're done, I'm going to ask you how many of you are going to start unit testing, and I hope it'll be more. So this is what happens. You know, unit testing is one of those things that everybody talks about it. You know you should do it probably, but you are under pressure to deliver a whole lot of features, so that's where all the focus goes. It happens to me all the time. You're in the middle of a sprint, you're like, oh man, we're running behind. All right, unit testing falls on the floor. This is a reason not to do it. So each sprint is going to produce more. So your first iteration, you don't have that much code. Your second iteration, you have more code. Your third iteration, you have even more. Eventually, you have a lot of code where you can't manually test it anymore. And really, it's one of those situations where, you know, people will say, we don't have time to do unit testing, so we're not going to do it. Well, really, it's not like you're saving time by not unit testing. You're probably just not testing. So automating the unit test can help ensure that that regression testing is done. Like I said, and this happens all the time to me too. You know, sprint 1, you worked on one feature. By sprint 3, you're asking yourself, hey, when was the last time we tested that one feature we did way back in sprint 1? Does that still work? And everybody kind of shrugs because they think it does. Nobody said it doesn't, but you haven't tested it in a while. There's also other situations where unit testing really shines. So a lot of the times when you're doing like integration testing, you're really focusing on the situation that works. You've got a service out there that's running. You know, what happens when the service isn't running? How does your application handle that? That goes untested quite a lot. And then user input, testing, that kind of stuff is things that are very manual and can be done very well with unit testing. So again, I like examples. So this is something that I ran into not that long ago. We've got a feature request to allow a user to upload a CSV file. It's going to contain a feature per row, fairly straightforward. Each feature is going to contain a time value, and that time value can be in one column or two columns. If it's in one column, it's going to be the date and the time together. But if it's in two columns, one of the columns is going to be a date, the other is going to be a time. We need to support the ISO 8601 standard and the RFC 2822 standard. Honestly, I don't know what's in those standards. We use Moment.js to ensure that part. But those are the standards, apparently, for date times. And then the feature data, once it gets parsed through the CSV, we need to add that to a hosted feature service we have. So if we were going to implement something like this and then test it ourselves, what would that look like? Well, I'd probably go generate a whole bunch of CSV files and then take each one of those and throw it at the application and see if it worked. And then if I change something, I'd be like, well, do those other things still work? And I'd have to take all those CSV files, pick them up and throw them at the application again and see if they still work. Very manual. So what does it look like if we do unit testing? And over here I have code that does basically this. It's not a ton of code. But I've got a class out here, again, Node, because I had all this stuff in Node. This is a class for uploading a CSV. It's got a method on it that parses a date time value. Like I said, it uses moment.js to do this, but there's some additional formats that we want to support beyond those other two standards that I said. So that's the method that does that. There's another one that will pull a raw date time value, either from a single column or multiple columns. So very standard stuff, very standard code that we have, but we want to test a bunch of different test cases with this. So if we look at the test file, it looks like this. And this is the part that I want to focus on. This parse date time or the parse date value, you can be very explicit about your test cases. So this is the value that it's going to find in the file. In this case, I'm assuming that if it's one column or two columns, they've been joined together in a string with a space in between them. So I'm ignoring that part here. But I have very fine-grained control over this stuff. I know exactly what the input's going to be and what the output is going to be. And then I can even test some failure cases to make sure that those are failing as I would expect them to do. And it's kind of interesting too, because the guy in the keynote today talked about, code as documentation. Well, your unit tests are really documentation as well. You can look through these things and know exactly if I throw at this is the value that's going to come out of that. Especially with dates and times, UTC and local time zones are always kind of a pain. So if you don't specify UTC here, it's going to assume that it is UTC with the way that yours works. And like I said too, I use moment.js for a lot of this parsing. If we had a need to not use moment anymore for whatever reason, I could refactor my code, run it through the unit test again, and know that the refactoring I did didn't break anything. And just to kind of show what this looks like when it runs, it looks like this. So I've got 31 passing tests. And interestingly enough, if you look at this error that's coming through here, it's an error from the moment.js library that says one of the methods that's being used has been deprecated. So at some point, I would expect that I would upgrade the version of moment.js I'm using, and it would break. And I would know that because I have unit tests. So who's going to unit test? All right. And there is, I have a slide for it. Go with this one. A lot of the topics that I talk about, I try to do a little bit of a high level on them because there is a unit testing session that Randy and George do. It goes into a deep dive about testing Web AppBuilder widgets and how you do that in that environment. I recommend that one. There was the building for production one that happened right before this. Again, like I said, it goes into the continuous integration, continuous deployment using things like Jenkins. That's a really good one. And then there's the one about advanced development tools and techniques, which is really good as well. So check those sessions out. They'll help. Back to you.
Okay. So Nick talked about, deployment options, for sharing source code, right? But sometimes we're only a party of one developing for ourselves, right? And then we're publishing it to our end user. So a good scenario is, so I have two different AWS instances, right? One that's a production server and one that's a staging. And what I do is we have an application extension that you register by going to add item, add application, and then you insert the HTTP location of that manifest JSON, right? Oh yeah, okay, let me fix that. Good point.
No, that was my fault. I got you.
Is that okay? Yeah. Well, my display settings got messed up. Let me fix those. All right. Okay, now we're back on track. All right. Okay, we're back on track. Okay. So what I was saying is, so we have two instances of Portal, right? So we have a staging and we have a production, and your developer that needs to get the widgets into your production. So what are the options? You can manually do it. But you can also use some of Esri tools to automate that. And the way you do it is, I have this web application here that includes this Flickr search custom widget here in this coffee shops. All right, I could simply copy this ID right here. So if I just copied here, and then if I go into Python here, I can do, they have this content get item, right? So I can input that unique string for that ID, and then basically I can assign this clone items variable to this function here called clone items, right? And basically, I clone that item, copy data equals true, and then I run it. Now, this feature has it's intensive, so it'll take a couple minutes to run, but I already did it. So if you go back to my other portal, which is, I don't have it up. Basically, let's see. I got to go to my bookmarks here. I got tons, man, tons. Let's go here. All right. So remember, I don't do certificates. I do self-signed serve. So this is just a development one. But if I assign it to my instance of portal, it will clone that information over. And as long as I can access that application extension, so I have a centralized web server, right, that houses all my widgets. And it looks like I'm getting a problem here. Things always don't work for me when you try and demo. But basically, as long as I can access that application extension, well, let's go to my remote. Oh, there it is. Okay, so long as I go to my application extension, what will happen is that clone method works great for hosted feature layers, and basically it will copy all that information over with that application and its dependencies over. So it's a great way where you could use like the Python API if you're going to be deploying applications from one server to another, like a portal, and you have a centralized repository for like a web server that houses those manifest JSONs of where you're going to put your widgets. You could use that to automate a lot of those different things. Okay. All right. Other things to consider when you're doing deployment is proxies, right? Because we do have to deal with cross-domain resources. So if you go to github.esri, we have our various resource proxies out there from PHP to .NET to Java, right? With great documentation if you need one. So basically, it's pretty easy to configure a web app proxy for Web AppBuilder. Basically, you just go in there, HTTP, give the URL prefix for your web adapter, and then proxy URL, right? And then if you have accessing secured services, you could define that server URL and do a client secret with client ID, and it's pretty straightforward. And if you're going to think about using proxies, I advise you to go to the GitHub page, and it's got great documentation there. It's pretty easy to deploy from there regarding the proxies. So we already talked about what about web app development, what about app deployment using Python stuff. That's a new way you can do it, plus with what you were doing as well. You're on a team of how many when you're working with your scripts and stuff and you guys are sharing source code?
I mean, right now, the one team that I'm on, we've got about 10 people, and we manage about 15 web applications that we build as part of we've taken a lot of analytic tools that they had in ArcMap and taken the tools, the analytic tool, published it as a GP server, and then wrote an app around each analytic tool that they had. So it's 16 apps, team of 10 people, and we do all sorts of stuff. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
So a little more intensive what he's doing, right, than if you're just a party of one. So that's another option I was just showing you can do. Nick already talked about some sessions, but what we like to do is in a couple minutes early for you guys to get to dinner. But please do us a favor, take a survey. We got to get some good shoes. Mine got some holes in them, so give us some good scores. But seriously, we appreciate you coming out, and we're always honestly looking for feedback how we can improve this session. And we hope you enjoyed it. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. If you're heading off to dinner, like this guy, no hard feelings.
And I mean, really too, feedback on
We'll take those questions now.
Feedback on the scenarios that I talk about would be very beneficial, because I know we talk about widget development quite a bit.
Yeah.
And in professional services, like I said, that's not really what I do. So it would be great to know from you guys if these scenarios that we're talking about are what you're encountering with Web AppBuilder. That would be good feedback for us.
Yeah. So, questions? Yes.
When you did the copy code on content, do you still have to go in there and change like the URLs for your web map and stuff?
It'll copy all the features over. It'll copy everything that wakes up that.
I'm sorry. I mean, like if I had a web map and in that web map I had a whole bunch of URLs that was pointing to my dev environment map, like dynamic map.
Yeah.
When we copy it over, it's still going to do that. So therefore, do I have to use use something like Assistant to go in and change the URL?
Yeah, the thing is with the clone item, the clone method, it works good with feature layers. There's things that it doesn't work with, and that would be one of them.
So for us, what we've done is exactly that, like you said with Assistant. We will go into AGO Assistant. We basically copy the JSON for that web map, copy that into source control, take all the variables that exist and replace them with the values that we had. And then we've got another file that exists separately that has for each environment what the URLs are for those services. So we will then build our web map for each environment, use AGO Assistant to upload them back to.
So you can upload it from AGO Assistant to a brand new one?
Yeah, I mean, you basically go out there, you view an item as JSON and you replace the whole thing. You can automate that too. Like there are APIs into Portal to put a new web map out there, so that part can be automated as well. That's how we do that. We manage, and we source code control that too, because the web map is great, but when you're doing development stuff, it's like, I don't want this other thing that's sitting in Portal that I don't have under source code control. Yep.
Yeah, the cloning method works good, like for hosted feature layers. It'll clone the application. Doesn't do complex things, like it won't clone like an advanced story map, but it'll clone like, hosted feature layers, the web map JSON. Go copy all that over, plus the features that are part of that as well. So we're good in that fashion. You had a question, sir?
Is it possible to run custom from the developer edition inside Portal, like custom widgets and a custom? Can I do inside Portal and run inside it?
So your question is, can you run a custom app?
Yeah, develop the edition
Uh-huh. Oh, Portal. It's just, the app would live on your web server.
Yeah.
Right. You could go into My Content, add item, reference the URL of the application. It would create a thumbnail, but it's still going to run on your web server at that point. Yeah.
Instead, if I want to run inside Portal, like an app, but with my changes, if I have a custom JS library, I want to run it inside Portal.
Yeah, you can't modify. You can't modify we do give you the code for Portal when we do, like, there's Web AppBuilder code in there. You could find it, but if you modify that, I think you violate your service level agreement, right? You can't.
David's right. Like when you generate a Web AppBuilder application and you download that and you want to host that gets hosted on your web server.
Yeah.
So you can't host that on Portal itself.
Yeah, it doesn't allow you to do like directional injection back into, because it's not a closed container of that. So we don't do any cross-checking of that. So the workflow would be, you can add as an item in your Portal, it groups a thumbnail, but that application is going to live on your web server. Right, yeah, so no problem. Yes, John?
Any difference in deploying a custom theme and a custom widget?
I don't know. I don't really deal much with the themes. So we can ask some of the other guys on the Web AppBuilder team how they handle custom themes. But it's not something that I've dealt much with. We basically picked one of the out-of-the-box themes, and we haven't touched it. It hasn't really been a focus of the customer that I've got right now. So we can ask them that. That would be a good question.
Do you mean themes from like source control type stuff, or just?
Well, in my case, I had to create a custom theme that needed a different layout of the widgets.
Yep.
Headers and footers and such.
Yeah. Yeah, one way you can do it is you can export that as a template, right? So let's say you go in a Web AppBuilder Developer Edition. There's an option when you go save it. If you go export, you can export it to ArcGIS Online or your local organization, which is your portal. And that will register as a template. And then when you have a web map, right, people can reference that theme into their web map as long as it just reads that JSON coming from the web server.
So that template, they could put their own collection of widgets in the predefined locations, right?
The template would have like predefined parameters to set, like there's certain JSON properties like title and stuff like that. It would work. They couldn't configure the widgets at that way. Those would have to be like pre-configured widgets. Yeah, I could show you, John, after, maybe tomorrow or something on that. Yes, sir.
I was trying to get more info on the instantiation of the Web AppBuilder code itself.
Mm-hmm.
Where it starts. So based on
Yep.
like the start point.
Yep.
However, like I'm trying to find a like kind of documentation where it says like these are the four pieces.
Mm-hmm.
When you have to do an application level change versus a widget level change.
Right. That's why I mean, if you look at the documentation for Web AppBuilder, like they won't go really into that stuff. It's focused on developing widgets. When you do what we're doing with it, it's beyond that. So you do have to go down sometimes into GIMU and start digging around and debug through that and see how Web AppBuilder is instantiating stuff. When I was talking about like finding the places in Web AppBuilder to put hooks to initialize your application logic, like that's not going to be something that you find in Web AppBuilder documentation. That's something as a developer you go kind of surgically look through there and find out those things.
So we did like version-based editing, like on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
Web AppBuilder does not support versioning
Mm-hmm.
capability on the fly. Any time sooner are we gonna add something similar to that?
I mean, you got to remember too, with, a lot of people will ask the question, can I do this with Web AppBuilder? Can I do this with Web AppBuilder? Anything you can do with the JavaScript API, you can do in Web AppBuilder. So it's just the way that you build it in there. You may need to write a custom widget to do that. If it's not functionality that you've got, it may need to be custom application that you've got. But can it be done? Probably yes. If you can do it with the JS API, you can do it with Web AppBuilder too.
Yeah, so I mean, I got an answer. So I was able to do it, but then again, I was scrub the code, going G2JS and like X, Y, Z files.
Yeah.
And I was trying to find some kind of documentation or white paper or anything can be shared.
Yeah, you won't find a whole lot about the GIMU stuff.
Yeah.
That's like the under the hood Web AppBuilder stuff. They have documentation that talks about like, my favorite is like interaction between widgets. And it's like, that's not how I want to do that at all. So that's not how I do a lot of that stuff. It's really notifications using Dojo notify stuff. So yeah, when you start straying beyond just the widgets, then you're in the land that I'm in a lot of the times. So feel free to come up and ask these questions. We can look through that stuff, but I don't think it'll be things that you find in the documentation for Web AppBuilder.
Yeah, you just got to think sometimes, are you reinventing? Are you spending so much time trying to make the hooks in a Web AppBuilder when you're better off just doing the JavaScript API directly, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, just the purpose of that. Like if you develop that custom widget, right, that does versioning, could that live in its own JavaScript API application where you're not trying to inject this other code in there, right?
And that's what we did.
Yeah.
Now we are using Smart Editor, which is like
Oh, okay.
really nice widget.
Yeah.
But Smart Editor was not able to edit the version.
Yeah.
Now we'll go and find the hooks.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, we spent time, we found it out, works great. But I was trying to see if we have something for people who can learn, like how to interact with the application level and
Yeah.
associations and all that.
Right. And I mean, that's what we do. Like when I mentioned, some stakeholder will see your application running and they'll be like, yeah, that's nice. We don't want that. That's that situation. It's like, we've got an out-of-the-box widget that does a lot of cool stuff, but we wanted to do this too. The best way to go figure that stuff out is to go look at the code of the Smart Editor widget and see what they're doing. And, the code's not minified, so you can change that stuff. It's not like the typical, when you look at the evolution of Web AppBuilder, it's exactly that. It's like, it starts with just people that don't know development configuring something. Then it goes into the widget development, custom widgets. So it's really good at that stuff. But when you get into starting to tweak the out-of-the-box widgets and really customize what GIMU is doing and your application logic, that's not part of what's really typical Web AppBuilder development. From what we've heard, that's why I'm asking if there's a lot of this that's going on. And they do have they've got a session that talks about extending and customizing Web AppBuilder widgets. So they talk about ways that you can do that, where you can extend the Smart Editor widget in a new widget, have that the Smart Editor stuff as a base class, and then override methods that are in the Smart Editor. Sometimes that works great. Sometimes there's so much logic that you need to change in one of the widgets that the geoprocessing widget for me is a great example, because we took that in like version, I don't know, it was like 1 dot something of Web AppBuilder, and we basically picked that whole widget up and took it over, and we started source code controlling it ourselves, and we own it, and we have changed that a lot. And it surprises me every time we upgrade Web AppBuilder versions that it still works, because it's like, man, I would have thought they would have put something in here that would have broken that, but it hasn't happened yet. So yeah, that's the thing with Web AppBuilder too. Like it's super, super flexible, but you got to start digging and looking and understanding the way that Web AppBuilder is built. And you can do all sorts of really cool things with it.
But you have to be cognizant of the fact that next release,
We changed.
go into those things that aren't documented.
Absolutely. And that happens to us too. Like because of the customer that we have, and that's why it's one of those really important things to do when somebody's asking for customizing the out-of-the-box widgets. Like you need to make sure, and as a developer, push back on that. Be like, do we really need this? Because if you start doing that, like the upgrades for Web AppBuilder that we do now have become challenging because when we do inject our code in the next version of Web AppBuilder, well, some of the API stuff in the guts of Web AppBuilder, because that's not what they don't guarantee that they're not going to change that. So some of those things can change and our stuff will break. So it's all things that you have to be cognizant of. So don't do it just willy-nilly. Do it because it's a really good business case for you.
Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with that. But matter of fact was the same thing. We invested so much. Doing it now, there are small changes which the stakeholders are asking. It doesn't take time, but you open up and update your existing stuff. I'm sure, like once you upgrade it, you're like think about the changes where you made.
Yep.
Totally agree with you.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I've developed some of our early widgets. I modified them, and then we changed in the core developer edition some class names and just broke everything. So it's like, you got to be cognizant of that, right? Yeah, so no problem.
Sure.
Well, good. We appreciate you guys having out. You guys have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.